Hi class, this is Christine Ami again. Today we'll be talking about Dine self-sufficiency in terms of food and food sovereignty. Here we have an image of myself. I did extensive work working with indigenous butchering techniques, um, as well as growing of corn. Here's a picture of our cornfields from a couple years back. When we take a look at consumption, I really want you to think about consumption from a holistic perspective, not just a gastrointestinal. Like, okay, so what do I eat? I want you to think about how does what I eat affect me holistically, not just physically, right? How does it affect the way that my mind functions, the way that I move, my emotions, my spiritual connection to food? And that's the kind of concepts that I want you to start thinking about when we think about consumption. Where does your food come from? How has your food changed? How has our food changed as indigenous peoples? What's the connection between colonization and food consumption? What would food decolonization look like? So when we take a look at this, we want to take a look at a couple of terms. One is food sovereignty. Now, food sovereignty, as you remember, is one of those hard-hitting words, right? To be sovereign by a legal definition, you need to own your own land, which Navajo people, for the most part, do not. You need to have a military structure, which the Navajo Nation does not, and you need to have your own economic system, which, once again, the Navajo Nation does not. When we would look at food sovereignty, and even though we can't hit that main legal definition, what we see happening in the social sciences and humanities is a breakdown of sovereignty, different types of values of sovereignty. And one way that people take a look at it is through food sovereignty. Now, when you think food sovereignty, think legal, think policy. Okay, right? Food sovereignty is all about policy that's trying to address how indigenous peoples are being impacted by the food that they are consuming now, and how they can culturally adapt indigenous foods back into their lifestyles. Another type of sovereignty that we have is an understanding of the sacred and divine sovereignty, understanding that the holy people gave us food, that each food that we intake, every food that we hunt, every food that we gather, every food that we grow and we consume has a purpose. And so in that way, we're truly understanding the origins of Ke, right? How does food connect us into a larger system? Not just looking at as food as our children, like we look at corn, but in a larger aspect, that food is, a main resource, a main staple. Wars were, put into place so that these types of sustainability resources were made for available for us. So keep that in mind. Self-determination when we're looking at food policy is important, because this is, what can I do? What can I do to eat healthier and culturally more appropriate? What kind of food am I going to hunt? Do I know how to hunt? How can I relearn how to hunt? Fish, gather, grow, eat. These are the kinds of things that we really look at from a self-determining area. How am I dependent on food? Am I dependent on the junction for food? Or am I dependent on bashes for food? How do I start to become more self-determined and control the food production, the food distribution and consumption in the economy that we exist in? And so to take a look at that, I have an example of the Lakota people who, as many people very well know, are thoroughly tied to the buffalo. And so when we take a look at the buffalo, the buffalo were made for the Lakota people. And as such, understanding that, the Lakota people tied the buffalo into their economic system and who they were and who they are. And so every piece of that buffalo gets used. Every piece of that buffalo, even to the poo that the buffalo has some sort of use that they've learned to utilize. And so when we take a look at that, those are the kinds of things that we want to start observing, is where is our excess? What do we do with our trash? When we butcher, do we use all the pieces? When we hunt, do we just leave things behind? And if we do, well, then why? Is that cultural protocol, or what's going on there? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to be able to ask. And so when we look at what happens when contact comes into play, when the Europeans come into contact with the Lakota people, what we first What we see after we see the initial war that takes place with them is the buffalo slaughter, right? We see the Great Plains buffalo population decrease tremendously from 15 million to 1,000 within less than 30 years. And the reason that the Europeans were hunting it was, first, there, yes, was a food source that they needed, but the second was also for a hunting game, and the third, which quickly in the matter of a couple years became the number one reason, was for the fur trade. They were looking to utilize that to enter into the fur market that was hitting the big boom during that time period. Now, when we look at that, I want you to think about it in terms of clashes of culture, right? The protocol that Lakota were using to go out and hunt buffalo enveloped, sweating, special herbs that were taken, a spiritual, there was a holistic preparation, much the same that Navajo men have in terms when they go hunting. There's a spiritual preparation that takes place, a holistic preparation that takes place. When we see the Europeans come in, that part starts to change, right? And we see it just for profit. There's a profit component that we're noticing. And I like this picture from Halea. I trained under Halea for visual sovereignty concepts because it's a negative of one of the scenes of the mass buffalo slaughters that were there, and the horse says, I didn't sign up for this. And when we take a look at this and we try to understand how our history also is entwining other animals, that it's much larger than just human versus buffalo, or European versus buffalo versus Lakota versus buffalo. There's all this integration that takes place that that we start seeing that really starts to break up this harmonious or balanced way of living that existed prior to it. Another point that I want to make up is that when we take a look at these types of scenes, this mass buffalo slaughter has very much become to parallel what the government wanted to do to the Lakota people. They wanted to come out and terminate the Lakota people, mass slaughters, mass wipeouts, but they couldn't do that because the treaties that were signed and different declarations of war and terms of war that were prearranged. So what takes place is that they go right after their food source. So the way that many animal studies people read these kinds of relationships is that the government came in and they slaughtered the buffalo, used them for whatever purposes, left behind whatever they wanted to, and because in hindsight that's what they wanted to do to the Lakota people, they just were unable to complete that to that extent. So when we take a look at Dine food timelines, prior to European arrival, we had all different sorts of ways to gather food, to hunt food. If we're looking at cultivated crops, because we were agriculturalists by then, we had big corn, squash, and beans, the three sisters that are commonly used. I like this picture that I have here of corn. I hate the pictures when you see the muddled corn with all the different colors in it in one cob, primarily because we grow corn. We try our best to keep those genetic influences separate, because each one of our corn represents a different gender. Each one of our corn represents a specific ceremonial use. Each one of our corn is made for specific food recipes. And so when I see that metal corn, everybody always calls it Indian corn. For me, that's an insult, because that's not how natives grow their corn. Navajos and Hopis grow their corn. They very much keep their corns in terms of purified colors for that relationship, that understanding of and how corn gets utilized outside of just the eating context. Wild animals, we had big game, elk, deer, antelope, mountain sheep that we hunted. Once again, proper protocol was taken. There was gender that was built into this, who could hunt and who can't hunt. And it's not a sexist thing. It's based off of responsibilities. And to your gender roles. Being Navajo isn't something that's easy. It's actually very difficult, and it's an obligation of responsibilities that you have to fulfill. And part of that are these gender relations and understanding gender roles. along the ways. There's small game, small prairie game. There's wild plants. There was a tremendous amount of people who knew all of the different types of herbs, which we don't see as frequently today. What could be eaten, what couldn't, what was poisonous, what was medicinal. Insects that could be eaten, as well as trading with other tribes. Right. Even though we were at war with ourselves and other people at times, there was trade that still took place. Now, what we see here in the 1500s to 1800s, we see of the influence of the Spanish. Um, Navajo people become much more ingrained in herding. We are introduced to domesticated sheep, so we transition from hunting sheep to butchering our own domesticated sheep. We have cattle and horses, peach trees and fruit trees that all get integrated into our agricultural food system. Now, we remained independent from the Spanish and Mexican government peoples, but our food is starting to change because of those cultural changes, those cultural nuances that are coming through. Now, during the 1930s, we had the livestock reduction that takes place once we are under U.S. treaty and U.S. rules and regulations. And even if we start taking a look at the treaty itself, food, understanding how our food gets controlled is written into that treaty. I will go ahead and post that treaty so that you guys have an opportunity to read that very thoroughly. But food is integrated into that. How many sheep are we allowed? How many cattle are we allowed? How large of estates are we allowed to build? It's all predetermined for us. In addition to that, once we start seeing the livestock reduction, and once again, animal studies people read that forced livestock reduction, which we can go further into detail about, as what the government wanted to do to Navajo people. They wanted to come in and exterminate us, but they couldn't. So how did they attack us? They attacked us through our sheep, and you hear people talk about this in the community. What is less frequently talked about is that Navajos had the opportunity, to compromise and to work and to negotiate, which we failed to do properly, and that also had a lot to do with the livestock reduction and the way that took place in terms of the burning of and shooting of these mass slaughters of sheep and goats that took place. After we see that is full takeover of the way that we eat through boarding schools, relocation programs. We are offered WIC and food stamps. We're now totally built into a dependency complex with the United States government. We eat what they give us. And so that's how that functions. Now, when we start taking a look at our food timeline by the 1968s, we have our first grocery stores, but what is supplied in those grocery stores, right? These high sweetened drinks, store-bought bread and milk, while the majority of the Navajo population at that time were lactose intolerant, and here we're being forced to change our diet and who we are and consume cow milk. And so gardens were starting to appear in small quantities, no longer fields, if they existed. And so when we start seeing fruits and vegetables start to become consumed less because they're more expensive in our food stores. So then the question becomes, where are we now? When we take a look at food sovereignty, we don't really have many. Remember, we're taking a look at policy, where we live in what's considered a food desert, meaning that it costs more for us to travel to border towns to get food than it is to buy our foods locally. So that means that we're forced, if we're going to take over our own policy, our own self-sufficiency. We need to learn how to teach the future generations how to farm. We need to learn how to teach the holistic approach to what food means to us as Navajos. That means reincorporating gender roles. Who can hunt, who can't, who can plant and when and can't. What are the language, songs, the prayers, the practices. How does that, help us to help our corn grow, help our food grow, and help us to even create foods in the recipes that we need for ceremonial purposes. How do we start reinvigorating these future generations to become excited about being self-sufficient in what we consume? And how will that consumption change us in terms of becoming better integrated with who we are as Navajo people and the understanding of from our food relationship of how it entwines us to the rest of the world. So that's where we're at right now. If you guys have any questions, shoot me an email.